Hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today we've got our final session of the Young Economist Conference today, and we'll be hearing from Professor Diane Coyle about a few things, including natural capital as well as comprehensive wealth. She's currently co-director of the Bennett Institute at the University of Cambridge, but has held many positions previously, including roles at the Treasury Department as well as at the BBC Trust. So just structurally, we're going to have around half an hour of talk from Diane, but it could be more, could be less, we'll see. And then the rest will be taken up by some Q&A from you guys. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Diane. Thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy.
Thank you for the introduction, Fred. I'm going to share my screen. And while I'm doing that, I feel I should be thanking everybody for yet another online session. So thanks very much for joining us today. And so this is the title of my talk, Building Forward. Can I just check, Fred or Kai, can you see that?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Thank you very much. So why building forward? Well, I'm sure you've heard the cliche, building back better. And one of the things I want to talk about is why going back at all is not going to be adequate for where we are and what we need. Because we are in this really extraordinary situation. At the start of the first lockdown in 2020, the Bank of England said we were in the worst recession for 300 years. And so that's a picture from the last time there was a big plague and recession, 1709, just over 300 years ago. And this came on top of a lot of existing problems in the economy, mainly in the UK, but also in other countries. Lots of people in jobs paying very low wages. The employment growth we've seen over the past 10 years or so has been either very well paid professional jobs, people who've got degrees, or very low wage sectors. And along with the low wages has come some quite insecure working conditions, things like 0 hours contracts and short-term contracts. Really poor outcomes for some minority groups in the job market in terms of salaries, but also in things like health outcomes and housing. And that has a geography as well. This government has the phrase levelling up, referring to the fact that some parts of the country are much worse off than others. And these gaps are bigger in the UK than they are in other places. And it's often talked of as a north-south divide, but actually it's much more fine-grained than that. So within any region or even within any city, there are very poor areas, and London itself has some of the poorest local authorities in the country. And so the pandemic's making those worse. We've got a bounce back going on now, lots of increases in activity, people going out to cafes and shopping again, but also a lot of people who are left with debt, rent that they haven't had to pay for over a year, business rates that small businesses haven't had to pay. And so it's a very polarized kind of outlook. And then on top of this inequality, we've got some very long-standing challenges too. One of these is the fact that productivity has been flat for about 10 years, or a little bit longer. Now, productivity is one of those terms that economists use, and we assume that other people have understand it the same way we do. But for many people, it conjures up the idea of humans having to work harder. And that's not what it's about at all. It's really about all of the inputs that you have available to use resources and turn them into things that people want to buy. So it's not just people working hard, it's also what capital equipment have they got to work with, what intangible assets like data or blueprints or patents have they got to work with. And it matters because it drives or it makes possible increases in living standards over time. It's the increase in productivity that has enabled real wages and living standards to go up. Now, actually, wages haven't kept up with productivity recently, but productivity has been flat too, so even if it had, that wouldn't help. And what that means is that average living standards have been declining for the best part of a decade now. So we've got the productivity challenge. Then on top of that, we've got the digital transition, which people are worried is going to create long-term unemployment, just as previous waves of automation have done. And lots of businesses will find it challenging to adjust the way that they do business. So the gap between companies that know how to use data and digital technology and those that don't has been getting wider. That's part of the productivity problem. We need to get businesses to use the technology, But on the other hand, there's going to be upheaval that comes with that, and some people will go out of business. And then finally, we've got the environmental challenges, climate change, loss of biodiversity, depletion of resources, and the way that they're extracted, things like lithium for all our mobile phones. So that's really quite a bad place to be starting from. And one of the things I particularly want to focus on today is sustainability. The picture in the background of this slide is the sea on fire in the Gulf of Mexico. There was such a bad leak of from a drilling platform, gas drilling, that the gas set fire. And I don't know if it's still alight. This was a picture from earlier in the week. But to see the sea on fire is a pretty sobering image. We know there's a lot of evidence of climate change starting to have some really serious impacts. So what about sustainability? What does it mean? The meaning that the definition that I use is that we leave the future generations at least as well off as we are in the resources that we leave them available for their production and consumption. So people will be at least as well off in future. And once you start thinking about the future, you have to start thinking about a balance sheet. When we talk about the economy, we very often talk about growth in GDP, and that's a measure of the increase in production and consumption over a given time period, a quarter of a year or a year. But what it doesn't tell you is what's happening to the assets, the wealth that's used to enable that production and consumption. And once you start to think about a balance sheet, then you need to be thinking about the future, because the value of the balance sheet and the assets on that balance sheet depend on what you think is going to happen in the future. How much will that business be worth if it's a company balance sheet, or how much will the nation be able to sustain in the future? So quite a lot of the work that I do and my colleagues at the Bennett Institute is to think about how do we measure wealth. Now, when I say wealth, I don't mean a chest full of gold coins or a stash of Bitcoin somewhere. I don't just mean financial wealth, although that's part of it. Wealth includes lots of different kinds of assets. And so this slide shows you the kinds that we think about. And so the one that would come to mind apart from money and things in banks' balance sheets is physical capital, which is at the bottom here. The buildings, the machines that companies use, the telecommunications networks, the physical infrastructure like roads and bridges. So that's called physical capital, or sometimes produced capital. But then there's also human capital, which you've probably heard of too. It's another very familiar one. And that's the health and the skills of the population. It's often measured by education levels or by wages, which reflect education levels. But it includes health too, less often included in the measurements, but as we have seen in the past 18 months, a really important part of human capital. Then where shall I go next? We've got knowledge capital, which is partly things that you can patent or copyright, so ideas that you can write down in that way, but also know-how, how to do things. Sometimes this is called process innovation when you're thinking about companies. How do they organize what they're doing? An example would be having the idea of organizing production on an assembly line where different workers do different tasks and then pass it on to the next person, rather than the previous method of organizing production, which was one person responsible for producing an entire object, whatever it happened to be that was being manufactured. And then we've got social capital, which is the way that people come together, organize collectively to deliver public goods, to organize the way that transport moves. So it's another intangible, but it's a really important way of understanding the wealth of a community, and particularly a community's or country's ability to produce public goods that benefit everybody, not just individuals. And related to that, institutional capital. What's the quality of government? Something economists have focused on for developing countries quite a lot, where low institutional capital is thought to be the source of many problems of development. So, for example, you might have a corrupt civil service or corrupt government. And then finally, natural capital, to go back to the previous slide, which is nature, the stocks, the raw materials, the renewable resources like trees and fish, the atmosphere, all of those things about our planet that make it possible to have an economy at all. So this is called comprehensive wealth. It's a concept that the World Bank has been measuring for some time. And if you're going to have a prosperous country, you need to, in effect, be saving money, investing in all of these kinds of capital so that you're able to continue production and consumption that keep people at least as well off in the future as we have been in the past. And so we think about this comprehensive balance sheet. Now, actually, we've not been doing very well in investing. This is an image just of produced capital, fixed capital formation in the jargon of the statistics. And the UK is the country in the dark, solid black line at the bottom of this chart. But you can see that for all of these rich countries that I've picked out, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, Spain, and the UK, so big West European countries, all very well off, investment in produced capital has been declining since the 1970s. And this covers all the machines and all of the infrastructure and communications networks. So that doesn't look like a very good trend for sustainability. And we are worse than these other comparator countries. And that's just one part of it. Now, if that were just substituting, because we were substituting other kinds of capital, then perhaps you wouldn't worry. And to some extent, that's what's happened, because companies have been investing in intangible assets more than these produced or physical capital assets. They're investing in software, databases, generating ideas, research and development. But that's not the whole story, because other kinds of capital have also been diminishing too. And those are just the ones that we measure. So we have good measurements of physical capital. We've got partial measurements of human capital. But the other ones I talked about, we really don't measure very well at all. So I've put in the background here the atmosphere. One of the things we don't measure is what nature is doing for us. And it's partly because there are parts of nature for which there's no market, and we only count in the economic statistics things that have got prices and are exchanged in markets. And it's partly also because of all the externalities, the activities that are depleting nature, and particularly climate and biodiversity, that come about because of other economic activities, and we're just not measuring that at all. So as the slide says here, the World Bank estimates that those intangible capitals, the human, the social, the institutional, make up either between 3/5 and 4/5 of a country's total wealth. And we're doing a really poor job at measuring those. So for all we know, we're not just underinvesting in physical capital, we're underinvesting in all of these things too. And that means that we're stacking up for the future, not the same or better living standards, but actually worse living standards over time. And that would be the first time that had happened since capitalism started with the first industrial revolution. One of the important things about the work that we're doing is understanding that some of these capitals reinforce each other, and you get either downward spirals or upward spirals. This is an image taken from a recent report on biodiversity published by the Treasury, written by one of my colleagues, Partha Dasgupta. And it's a really important and interesting report, partly because of the evidence it gives us about loss of biodiversity and the impact that could have on the food supply in future. But it also paints a picture of the way these kinds of capitals interact with each other. So, for example, the human and produced capital link is one that we're used to thinking about from economics textbooks, that you put labor and ideas, you produce machines, you build infrastructure. That produced capital is one of the inputs to producing goods and services, and also to paying people incomes. So that's the sort of market exchange of the labor market and the goods market that we're very familiar with thinking about. We are ignoring much more the role of natural capital in this. And there are different links, as you can see on this chart. So, for example, production using the produced capital creates waste and pollution. And it's taking from nature natural resources, what are often called ecosystem services, using water, the climate cooling us down, or trees cooling down our cities. And then there's a link between natural and human capital too. Human activities, again, cause pollution and waste. And anybody who's ever dropped a piece of litter in the green space, please don't do it again. But we also, as humans, get incredible benefits directly from nature, and not just indirectly from economic activity. We can get food from crops, but also it's important for our health. Something else that we've seen quite substantially in the past year or so. I've happened to be running some surveys of the amount people say they value free digital services like Facebook or online shopping. And we included parks as a free non-digital resource to see how that compared. We ran the survey in early March 2020, and again in May 2020. And you won't be surprised to hear that people's appreciation of parks had increased really quite substantially over that 3-month period. But in normal times anyway, we get mental health and health benefits from being in nature, from clean air, and from the leisure that we can enjoy when we're in green spaces. So these things interact as well. This diagram's only got 3 of my capitals, but I would say they all interact with each other, that social capital is part of the story about how humans interact with nature, for example, or indeed with their workplace. So we need to think about these links, so not just measuring each capital individually, but how do they each relate to each other? We need to get better measures and a better understanding of all of these interactions. For anybody who works in finance or is interested in working in finance, this might ring a bell. It's the way that financial investors think about their portfolios. They don't just think about what benefits they get from each single company or government in which they invest their money, but what are the interactions, what are the correlations between them? And in a financial portfolio, that would be called the betas. Well, that matters in this broad economic and social portfolio as well. We need to understand the relationships between all of these assets that we need. These are World Bank figures, and they show you that over time, the amount of produced capital has been going up. These are global, and so a lot of investment over the past 20 years has taken place in developing and emerging market economies. So although there has been a deep decline in that investment in some of the rich countries, it's been going up elsewhere. There's been a gentle increase in human capital over time, but much less. And so the ratio of capital, produced capital to human capital has been going up. But a big decline, a really troubling decline in natural capital. And although you can look at these things separately, at some point, the interactions between them will kick in. And the ability of nature to sustain more production will actually undermine the value of the other capitals, the produced and the human capital. And so all of those lines will start going down at some point in the future if we don't start taking really seriously the depletion of natural capital. So we need to think about how to measure it, but also how to restore it and how to use it much more sustainably. And I put a lot of emphasis on measurement because I think people don't understand the scale of these losses in nature and what the implications will be. And if we can get that message across in the statistics, rather than just looking at GDP figures, perhaps policies and company and individual behavior will start to change. So we need to start thinking about the economy. And I've got the sort of conventional bit at the top of this slide as sitting on an infrastructure of nature. And that's what this chart is showing. We've got all the ecosystems that matter at the bottom here. And I would like you to start thinking about nature as being just like the electricity network or the road system or the communication system. It's that platform on which all of our activity is going to rely. And there are different elements to that. Biodiversity is much less well understood than what's happening to climate. And that was why the report by Partha Gupta was so important. And we've got also mineral resources, and so the non-living parts of the environment on the right-hand side of this bottom bit of the diagram, all of those things that we use to manufacture products. And these natural ecosystem services allow what were divided into provisioning, regulating and maintenance and cultural ecosystem services. So provisioning are the services that you use directly to produce something, so crops that enable you to produce food. Regulating and maintenance are those that regulate the systems in which we operate. So that would be biodiversity or climate, and enabling us to grow the crops that give us the food. And then cultural services are the benefits that we get directly from being in nature, from the mental health benefits and so on, or just going to a beautiful place and having a good time, which is not to be underestimated. All of those things enable the much more conventional kinds of capital in the economy, and so the economy sits on this piece of infrastructure. That's the way we need to start thinking about it, and obviously it's really important to politicians, or at least to the statements that they make. How that translates into policy and behaviour, well, it's crunch time now, as we come out of the downturns from the pandemic and think about how we want to build forward. What kind of economy and society do we want to build? Think about the measures, we need to start thinking about shadow prices. And so as this chart says, the market price is what is paid in markets for goods or services or assets. That's the conventional bit of economic measurement. The shadow price includes the social benefits that are not well or not at all measured. And so to get those measures that I want of natural capital or social capital, we're going to need to start figuring out what these shadow prices and extending the accounts that we build for the economy as a whole to build all of those in. But shadow prices are really important, and accounting for shadow prices in affecting the way that businesses are behaving. The numbers are important because, as I said, it's very hard to value, and we don't do a good job of measuring all of these components of wealth broadly understood. But we do know that putting a zero in is wrong. We've been valuing nature at zero. Although many people find it uncomfortable to say you can put a price on nature, I would argue that putting some number in there really matters. Putting some shadow price on it really matters, because if we're using a zero, we're going to undervalue it. And we've got to start somewhere. Building the data that we use now in the economy took about 20 years after the Second World War. So let's start that 20-year process right now. But just to give you an example of why the shadow prices matter and are actually really hard, this is a chart showing what's happened to prices of different kinds of renewable energy over time. And if you look at a book written not all that long ago, maybe in the mid-2000s, it would have said, oh, solar energy and renewable wind, they're very worthy, but they're never going to be competitive with fossil fuel energy. We're always going to have to subsidize them. What this chart is trying to say is that once you start thinking about the future, if you imagine a different kind of future, you price in a different kind of shadow price for that asset. So if we start imagining a future where all of energy is renewable, we make it possible to think about much cheaper sources of renewable energy, because we are going to have a future where all of the demand for electricity will be for renewable energy. So we have created expectations of a very large market for renewable sources of energy that enables mass production of photovoltaic cells or batteries or battery storage. And once people start producing at scale and learning how to do it, then the prices fall much more dramatically than if you had expected a future where there was only a very small market for renewable energy. So these shadow prices are a tricky business. They depend a lot on expectations of the future. And that's true of any asset market. You only have to look at the volatility of stock markets to understand that this is shaped very much by expectations and events. But the policy point here is that you can alter people's expectations using policies. You can do it using measures and the statistics, which I think are important, but you can also do it using policies by saying, for example, it's not going to be allowed to sell non-electric cars after 2035 or whatever the government has announced. And so we can, by the decisions that we take today and by the expectations that we set today, change the reality of the numbers and the reality of companies and individuals' behavior. The expectations really matter. And these prices for renewable energy have fallen dramatically over time, and it's now very affordable indeed. We'll make the switch much more quickly than we had first thought. So I'm getting towards the end to leave lots of time for questions, just a few more minutes. There are lots of future challenges. We have actually done a lot of damage to our environment. We are at a really dangerous stage in terms of climate and in terms of biodiversity as well. This is has really serious implications for food security, including in parts of the world where there are many hungry people still. And as we've seen, there's a risk in depleting biodiversity and extending into areas of rainforest and mountains of more zoonotic diseases. That's the name for diseases like COVID-19, which jump from wild animal species to humans. Ebola was another one of those. We've also got lots of pollution, and we have limited people's access to green space and nature. It's very unequally distributed. You're much more likely to live in a street with trees if you're rich than if you're poor. And that has implications for the inequalities of health and human capital too. On top of that, there's all the digital transformation, the other half of my research, and that's going to have very unequal benefits, high costs for people's jobs if we don't manage that transition. We didn't do very well in previous ways of automation in helping people change their skills and get long-term jobs. And we've got to digitally transform public services too. Government is really not very good at serving people online in the way that private companies are. But with all the pressure on the public finances, that transformation is going to have to happen. Those are big challenges. I think the good news is that we can, through the work that we do as economists and future economists, and also just by the way we think collectively about the future and change our expectations collectively, can make a big difference. This is an image of the Thames Tideway Tunnel, and you might be wondering why I've put that here. And the reason is that this is the first extension to London's sewerage wastewater system since it was first built in 1859. The engineer who designed and built it was called Joseph Bazalgette, and he got commissioned to do it because the Thames was so full of sewage that summer that it really smelled bad, and Parliament, right by the Thames, couldn't carry on meeting because the smell was so bad. So they then voted to fund the original sewage system. Why does this matter? Because it's a long time since 1859. And what Joseph Bazalgette did was build 150 years worth of capacity. So he wasn't thinking about short-term financial returns. He was thinking about the broad wealth and all of those intangible benefits that would come from building a system that would keep the capital clean and healthy for a century and a half. And it hasn't had to be extended until now. And so that's the kind of vision of what recovery we want from the pandemic and the shutdowns, and the kind of society we want to be. We want to be more equal. We want to create wealth sustainably. And we want to shape expectations of the future so that we can do that. So that's why this was our slogan for our recent report: building back's not the challenge, building forward is something better. So I put in the slides, which we can share with you, some things to read if you're interested. And I'm going to stop now. And I think Fred is going to start handling the questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Diane, for the fascinating talk. And thank you very much for the presentation as well. I wanted to ask firstly, I understand in order to achieve a sustainable generation, we need to be investing more in natural capital. How do you see that, apart from on the energy scale and the transport scale? How do you see a society where we are investing in this natural capital, maybe on a smaller scale that everyone can take part in?
Well, that's a great question, Kate. So there are different ways to think about it. And one of them is the one you've highlighted. There are different scales at which this has to happen. And some of it's very large scale, and governments and big companies will have to invest in energy generation and the energy network, different kinds of transportation and so on. But you can think about it at all the different scales as well. So different cities might think about different programs to clean rivers or to plant trees. There's a big role for agriculture, thinking about making agriculture less intensive and more sustainable so that farmers can use fewer fertilizers. because the extraction of nitrate fertilizers is quite harmful, and biodiversity would increase. But you can also think about it at an individual scale. And although each of our actions by themselves won't make much difference, whether it's recycling, planting bee-friendly plants in the garden, walking rather than driving, but adding up, when millions of us are doing that, that can make a difference too. And I think it has to be on all of these fronts. And I would say that people of younger generations are much better at thinking about these. It's much more front of mind. I don't know if anybody listening this took part in the Friday strikes, the climate strikes, but I think there's a real change of mood generally about the things that we need to do individually and as companies and as government to bring this about. But all the bits of natural capital need sustaining and need investment. We've depleted too much of it.
Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Fred now for the next question.
Yeah, so I've got a question here from Ollie. Do you think that new technologies like electric cars and the subsequent reduction in pollution from driving will change the way that people think about natural capital?
I don't know which way round it will be. It's really interesting to think about this sort of social norms that will have to change for us to change the way that we drive. For a long time, cars have been a lot of people have put a lot of emotion into their cars. People have loved their cars, they've wanted certain kinds or certain colours. And there's the joy of the open road or the sense of freedom that you get from being able to just get in the car and go somewhere. And that sort of those habits that we have will probably have to change quite substantially. Maybe it will be more car sharing, more car clubs. Maybe we'll just have to get used to getting into a smaller car and it's not got the acceleration because electric engines aren't quite so fast, or they've got a different feel to them. So I would hope that clever people in advertising agencies working for the car companies are figuring out how to make the electric cars really glamorous, and that will change the way that we feel about it. But norms can change quite quickly, and I think recycling is a great example. Not that long ago, as little as 20 years ago, there was very little domestic recycling of rubbish. And the combination of councils being required to do more recycling of rubbish, and also people just getting used to it, and the idea of what was acceptable and what not really, really changed. So I think there'll be an interaction between what we're forced to do and how we feel about what's the right thing to do.
Thank you very much. And we have a question from Antonia here. And Antonia understands how the social capital is linked to natural capital, and there's these different feedback loops. And she's asking that what economic tools can help to build a society and build this social capital idea, which basically which creates a collective duty of care for the natural world and the natural capital.
It's another great idea. So social capital is something that there was a bit of a fashion for talking about probably in the early 2000s. And then people figured out it was just quite hard to define and measure it. So economists in particular lost interest in it because we like to be able to download some data and run some regressions. But at the same time, a lot of work in economics made it very clear that the social capital matters a lot for how the easier to measure things like productivity or wages turn out. And so I think there is still a gap in understanding and measuring social capital, but particularly in understanding what creates it and what effects it has. In sociology, people talk about bonding and bridging social capital, and the bonding is the sort of close links with people like your family and your friends. But the kind that matters for the economy is the bridging social capital. And that's because it might help you find a better job if you have somebody who's a friend of a friend who knows that you're looking, and that's a link that will help you get a job that you prefer. Or it might help you in work, watch somebody in the next office and you figure out there's a better way of doing something. All sorts of bits of information about how to do things better depend on that kind of social capital. And then there are also things that just make life more civilized. So the social capital involved in queuing politely for the bus rather than everybody trying to get on at the same time, and actually it makes it much slower. So we don't have a very good idea about how to sustain and create this. One of the newer concepts at any rate, is social infrastructure, which is talking about what the organizations or buildings or environments that make it possible for social capital to develop. Is it having libraries? And there's an American sociologist called Eric Kleinenberg who's recently written a book about how important libraries are. Or is it a community cafe, or a parent and baby group where people can learn better about how to teach things to their young children? So this is a very active area of research. It's picking up again, and the government has actually got a lot of interest in understanding how to, what are the things that they might need to do that communities are not going to do themselves to build social capital.
Perfect. So yeah, you mentioned the government there, and also their role in the Treasury, as well as setting up the Dasgupta report. But a question from Jasper is, whose job is it to fix this? So tying in all of these externalities that we're just taking for granted, how on earth are we going to fix them, and whose job is it? Because surely the government won't touch it due to the links and implications for inflation.
Yeah, well, it's difficult because what you need to happen is for lots and lots and lots of people all to change the way that they behave, lots of individuals, lots of companies. I think that kind of coordination can only come from the government, and it can be in lots of different ways. It can be by setting regulations. They can set limits to how long people can drive internal combustion engine cars and have to switch to electric cars. It can be things like technical standards. So the kinds of standards for generating renewable energy and the way that feeds into the electric grid. So the government's going to have to set that, or setting standards for smart metering. What are the metadata standards, and what kind of technical standards are needed for the smart metering system to work? So it can do regulations, it can do standard setting, it can do taxes to discourage harmful activities, and economists are very fond of talking about carbon taxes or increasing taxes on fuel. Now they are, as the question implies, pretty unpopular. And it's partly because of a broad inflationary impact, but it's also partly because the distributional impact of that is uneven. For cars, it's drivers, and so if we want people to stop driving and use public transport more instead, that might be okay. But when you're talking about people's energy for their homes, that's something that you'd want to worry about for distributional reasons. The economist's argument is you've got to incentivize the right kind of behavior by charging more for electricity. And if you think people on lower incomes are going to be disadvantaged, then you need to find another way of making that up to them, either through elsewhere in the tax system or through benefits. So you've got to use two different instruments in that case, one to tackle the behavior with regard to electricity use, and one to tackle the distribution question. Now, that's what economists would do. Politically, it's much harder. And so I think the spirit behind the question is right. And it's why you can't just do economics when you're thinking about these policy questions. You've got to understand the engineering and the technical issues, but you've also got to understand the political constraints too.
The next question from Emily, she's asking on an economic scale, is it possible to maintain this high economic growth and devote more resources to natural capital, or will these resources slow economic growth? And if so, how will we be able to convince politicians and economists, particularly in developing countries, that it is good to sacrifice economic growth for this investment or the reallocation of resources?
Yeah, this question has, Emily has put her finger on a really difficult issue. And it's obviously particularly hard to say to poor countries, well, we rich countries have created the climate problem, but it's too bad you can't grow anymore. And that's just morally unacceptable. And so the challenge is finding ways to grow that at a minimum are not going to harm natural capital anymore. And if possible, we find a way to do some natural capital restoration. Now, the way that works in the figures, if you're investing in schemes like green energy transformation or new types of vehicles, that would actually boost growth and create jobs. So that helps resolve this dilemma. But there will be costs involved in that investment, taxes to pay or borrowing costs to pay on that. And we might also want to think about less growth in other dimensions. So perhaps less growth in consuming plastic would be one example, and that's going to reduce growth. And that's part of the reason that I concentrate on getting people to think about a different measure of growth, that we would like to try to incorporate in our headline figure, not just the market exchanges currently in GDP, but some of those currently unmeasured things. And so we'd have a truer sense of what growth is. So let's measure sustainable growth, not just GDP growth. And then we still want some sustainable growth to happen, particularly in lower income countries. I do think it's important to have growth. And there are people who argue that we shouldn't. There's a phenomenon, or people that advocate degrowth or zero growth. And that's just difficult for two reasons. One is because within any country, you only get zero or negative growth by taking things away from people, and that's politically almost impossible. But it's also because innovations are one of the things that drive growth. And so if you're saying, well, we can't invent smartphones, or we can't invent vaccines, you then are arguing, well, what are we going to take away instead? And that, again, I think is a really hard sell politically. So I argue for sustainable growth and measuring it in the right way, but it does rely on some technological fixes that will help us achieve that. So it's not a guarantee.
Perfect. I've got a question here from Andy. What can students do to help the government and to help their country to try and be more sustainable and to improve biodiversity?
Oh, I think the voice of students is a really important one. You know, anybody who spends their time with students and young people will know how important this is to many of you. There's a great demand for all of our courses to incorporate more on sustainability, and the number of courses is increasing, so people really want to learn about it. And I think the other very important thing is to take that message to employers, because businesses face a lot of pressure to focus on a bottom line, on quarterly share price increases, on all those conventional metrics, but they really need to hire and keep skilled people. And so as you get on and go into the labour market, make sure that employers understand how important this is, how important sustainability in their business practices is. And that will really have quite a powerful effect on what businesses do and therefore what governments do later.
Yeah, that's very interesting. On the tone of employment and employers and the job field, Andrew was asking if he wanted to have an impact in this field, what kind of careers or university courses would you suggest, or should he be thinking about?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I haven't thought about it, which is why I'm calling it interesting. One thing that I really think about these big problems that we face is that they need people from different disciplinary backgrounds. It isn't enough just to study economics or political science or climate science. I think for people concerned to bring about changes in the way businesses and policymakers behave, you need to think about all of these things together, which is why we set up our institute to be interdisciplinary. And so we're working across different academic disciplines. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need people to study any of the individual disciplines, and that's how you learn, you know, the depth of knowledge that you would need to do any of these. So I think I'm coming around to saying it almost doesn't matter what you study, as long as this is an important element in what you study. So I think the most important thing is choosing something that you like doing, where your passions lie. And if this is one of the passions, then you will find a way to contribute to it when you go into the workplace.
Great. So this is a really good question, actually. How have behavioral biases and traditional ways of thinking held back progress within this kind of line of improving sustainability? And what can we do really to overcome that?
That's very interesting. Well, one of the obvious biases is that people are really bad at thinking about things that will happen over the very long term. There's a kind of present bias. And you see this over and over again in people putting off doing things that it would be sensible to do quickly. One example would come from a completely different area, and that's monetary policy. And one of the reasons central banks were made independent is that it's much better if you can see inflationary pressures building up to raise interest rates early, and then you don't have to raise them as much as if you leave it later. And so there are lots of areas where people find it very hard to act early and quick enough. And actually, we've seen it with shutdowns as well. It's not just our government, many governments just left it a bit too late to shut down, and therefore case rates went up much more than they needed to have. So I think that's one of the really key behavioural biases to overcome. And there's also the question about how much should you discount the future? And there's a lot of economic research and literature about this. And we tend to put too much weight on things that are going to happen near term than long term. But when you're talking about natural systems, what happens longer term is much more important. And so finding a way to get governments and financial markets to think about a much lower interest rate when they're thinking about long-term natural capital assets is another thing to overcome. There's optimism bias as well. I mean, there are lots of these behavioral biases.
Yeah, just leading on from this talk about the economics and the monetary policy and on an economic scale, do you think the concepts or the way of the teaching of economics is at the moment, do you think this needs to be altered or progressed in order to include more about this nature capital side or achieve these goals of environmental sustainability? And how far do you agree with this?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would like to see more change. I was one of the many academics around the world involved in developing the core economy online course and text, which a lot of universities are now using to teach first-year undergraduates. And part of the point of that was including things that didn't get included in traditional courses, so inequality, nature, innovation, or in there. But I would like to see a broader approach to economics, really. When I was a student, we studied economic history more than is currently done. And that, history is a really important source of evidence for lots of economic things, like how does technology change over time, or what are the big macroeconomic trends. You've kind of got to study economic history to understand that. So I'd like to see that. I'd like to see more political economy. A lot of economists will say, oh, well, we know the answer to such and such a problem if only the politicians would do it. But if you're giving economic advice that politicians can't follow, then it's not good advice. So I think those political economy questions are interesting too. So I would do less maths and more of these historical and political approaches in economics. Not that I think that the maths is unimportant. You've got to be able to do algebra and calculus to a reasonable degree, but I think it's been overplayed in university courses.
Thank you very much for that. I will pass that on to my maths teacher. So I've got one of my own questions here, and it's from one of your first slides. It was about, you had the sort of the circle with the natural capital as well as the sort of knowledge capital. And there are obvious countries with natural capital advantages. They've got oil reserves and mineral reserves, etc. But are there countries with inherent knowledge capital advantages? And if so, why?
Yes, there are. And they're the countries that have either invested a lot in research and development, and the obvious examples would be America and China, where they have invested at scale in certain frontier technologies. And that's why the big digital companies, partly why the big digital companies are American and Chinese. So it's partly investing in ideas makes a difference. And another example might be Singapore, where they have invested really in the a very specific skill of logistics and being a hub for organizing production. So it's a small place, it's got very little by way of natural resources and a very uncomfortable climate, but it's still become a very rich country through using ideas in a different kind of way. So it is possible, but it's probably the hardest kind of capital to build. And the more obvious route is to think about technologies in which you already have some kind of advantage and invest in that.
Thank you. Thank you. I've got a really interesting question from Tom here, and he's asking, of the jobs that will be created through this investment in green energy or green or nature capital, how much will the non-skilled benefit? I understand, and he understands that a lot of the employment will be for skilled people for these solar panels. You talked about the photovoltaic cells, but how much will it be inclusive? To what extent will it be inclusive to everyone in an economy for this green movement?
Yeah, that's really important because what we've seen so far has not been inclusive, and there are lots of jobs that are really a bit rubbish out there. And I think part of the key is to think about skills in a much broader way. The skills that are going to be needed are those that work well with computers, essentially. And that might be very sophisticated cognitive skills of the kind that you learn at university, but it might equally be other kinds of human skills that computers can't do. So you might think about the job of being an intensive care nurse, which is partly very technical. Nurses have degrees, they've got a lot of kind of formal knowledge, but they also have a lot of very human skills of empathy and being able to pick up subtle signals from people and so on. Or in social care, where the ideal would be to take all these very badly paid, precarious jobs, which have largely been done by immigrants, and introduce technology to do monitoring of patients and clean rooms using robots and so on, but make sure that the care workers themselves have human skills so that they can, when they're caring for somebody, have a chat to them about whatever it is that interests them, be it the football or classical music, you know. So thinking about a much broader range of non-cognitive skills that are things that computers can't do, and rewarding those properly and recognizing them, I think would be absolutely essential.
Perfect. Dr. Wisson, did you want to ask one final question before we wrap up for this afternoon?
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, we are. Yeah, that's a good shout on the timing. I guess one last question would be for a student called Ollie, for you, Diane. Do you think sustainability is something we can solve in inverted commas, or is it a process we need to continually work at?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I think it's probably a process. I don't think an economy or society is ever going to be static, and this will take a long time to get to where we might like to be. And by the time we get there, there'll probably be some other problems to solve. So yes, Ollie, I think it's a process.
Thank you very much, Diane. We're going to have to stop the questions there, but thank you for your presentation exposing new eyes to this idea of natural capital and how these feedback loops work with the social and the human and the physical capital. And thank you very much for your informative answers as well. I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Wisson to round off the day. But yeah, I'd like to, on behalf of everyone listening, thank you very much.
And thank you, Kai and Fred, for fielding all the questions.
Brilliant. So just let me wrap up there. So we're coming towards the end of the day. First of all, a huge thanks to Diane for a fantastic talk and Q&A session there. Really appreciate that. Thank you to everyone who's participated over the day, all of the speakers, and all the students and attendees for participating. I hope you've enjoyed it and got something out of it. It's been a lot of fun for me. Take care and have a lovely evening. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.